Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this faculty workshop. My name is Yrjö Lappalainen, and I'm a data services librarian here at Zaid University Library. And today I will present to you an introduction to research data management. And here's what the agenda looks like. So first, I will be talking about the definitions of research data management and what is generally involved in it. And then I will continue with more concrete tips, tricks, and best practices for managing your data. We will take a look at data management platforms and about metadata, file formats, how to deal with sensitive data, some tips for data storage and backup, data citation, also how to find existing data sets, and how to make a data management plan. And finally, I will also present some useful research data management guides and other training resources that are freely available. Okay, so let's get started. What is research data? Let's start with the definition. It's any information that has been collected, observed, generated, or created to validate original research findings. So it's any information for the purpose of producing original research. And the type can be pretty much anything. It can be, for example, instrument measurements. It can be experimental observations, still images, video, audio, documents, spreadsheets, and so on. It can be quantitative. It can be qualitative. It can also be simulated or generated by some software. It can also be physical, for example, artifacts or specimens or samples. And also sketches, diaries, lab notebooks. So basically anything to produce original research. So what is research data management? That covers all the activities around this data. So starting from the planning all the way to sharing and publishing your data. So planning, collecting, organizing, managing, storage, security, backing up, preserving, and sharing your data. The goal is to make sure that your data is managed according to legal, statutory, ethical, and funding body requirements. So this definition is already 10 years old, but it's very accurate. So the idea of research data management is to make sure that you take good care of your data and fulfill all of these different requirements. Okay, so research data management is usually presented as a life cycle. So you can find different versions of this image online, but they all have the same basic idea and the same basic components. So of course, this is the ideal version, and things don't always follow this path exactly. But ideally, you begin from planning and designing, then you collect and capture your data, you collaborate and analyze the data, you store and preserve it, and finally, at least ideally, you also share and publish it. And then maybe somebody else can discover your data and start the same cycle with the data that you have collected in your research. And of course, you can also discover and use data that others have published. So this probably seems like a lot of work, and you may wonder why you should do any of this, but there are plenty of good reasons. So first of all, this is a good scientific practice. So you ensure the integrity and reproducibility. Also, it increases your own research efficiency, so it's definitely for your own benefit. You also ensure that research data and records are accurate, complete, authentic, and reliable. And it will definitely save time and resources in the long run. Of course, this applies to everything. If you plan ahead well, you will spend less time worrying later in your project. Also, you minimize the risk of data loss. So nobody wants to lose their data, especially if you're doing research and putting lots of effort into it. Also, it prevents the duplication of effort, meaning that someone somewhere in the world might be doing research on exactly the same thing as you, and they probably would be happy to use your data set instead of collecting the same thing on their own. So this way they can either repeat the findings or find some other angle with the same data set. And of course, this also works the other way around. If someone has already collected data on your topic, I'm sure you'd be happy to use it in your research, or at least it can be an example of data collection in your field. And of course, one important reason is that many funders are increasingly requiring these plans. It can be that you won't get any external funding unless you present a data management plan. But of course, this is definitely not the only reason to manage your data. So when you start thinking of all this, it may seem like a lot of work at first, but of course you'll get better with practice, and eventually you'll be happy that you planned things in advance and manage your data systematically. And once you get familiar with these practices, you'll be doing it almost automatically. The key principles behind research data management are called FAIR principles. So data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And what does it mean? How can you make your data fair? To make it findable, you should use rich metadata to describe your data. So you should describe in plain English what's included in your data set. You can have, for example, abstract and keywords to describe the data set. Also, you should use persistent identifiers, for example, DOI, Digital Object Identifier. This is usually included in many repositories and services. So once you submit your data there, it will also get a persistent identifier. If you use just normal links to share your data or any output, those links will most likely stop working after some time because they are not persistent. And also you should deposit your data in a searchable source. So in other words, some data repository that is indexed by a search engine. And I will talk more about these services and repositories later in this session. And to make it accessible, you should always try to make at least the description of your dataset available, even if the actual data is not. So, of course, all data cannot be shared due to privacy or some other reason, but you should publish at least the description. So this way other researchers will know that such a dataset exists and they can contact you for more information. And this is also good like scientific practice, and you can get attention for your work and maybe even find some collaborators for the future. And also you should include authentication steps to restrict access if necessary. And to make it interoperable, you should use open formats and follow community standards. There can be, for example, keywords or some controlled vocabularies that are specific in different fields. So you should try to follow the conventions of your own field. And if you have never published any data before, it would be probably a good idea to find some examples from your own field first. Okay, and to make it reusable, you should provide clear documentation for the data set. So some kind of instructions how to access and process the data. And also a usage license that enables others to reuse your data. And for example, Creative Commons licenses are highly recommended. So when you use a Creative Commons license, others can use your data as long as they follow the conditions and mention your name in their own work. Okay, so that's the background, and now let's move on to a little bit more concrete level and take a look at these best practices and tips and tricks. So first, I will introduce a few platforms for research data management. Then we'll also briefly look into metadata, file formats, how to deal with sensitive data, storage and backup, citing, and also how to find existing data sets. And let's start with the platforms. So these are the 4 major platforms that you can use to manage your research data. Open Science Framework, Figshare, Mendeley Data, and Zenodo. And of course, there are also other platforms and tools available, but these are the most common ones. All of these are free to use, but there can be some limitations in file size, for example. And there's usually a paid version available without the restrictions, of course. And all of these have like similar basic functionalities. You can search for data made by others. You can work with active data. You can share it with your collaborators during the project. And you can also publish your dataset once the project is complete. And all of these platforms also have persistent identifiers. So you can use that to share your data. So in other words, these are like all-in-one platforms that help you to follow the FAIR principles that we discussed. And I would like to highlight the Open Science Framework specifically. So this is completely free, and you can also use it for other research collaboration purposes. So it's not just for data management. You can also use it, for example, as a project workspace. And it has very impressive features. First of all, it's a centralized location for all content. So all project files are in one place. Also, it has an access and version control. So you can define access for the whole workspace or for each section separately. And you can also restore previous versions of your documents if something goes wrong. And it has integrations with many third-party services. So for example, Google Drive or Dropbox or Mendeley, Zotero, GitHub, and many more. And it's also a repository with persistent identifiers. So I highly recommend this platform. And the other three platforms, Figshare and Mendeley and Zenodo are great as well, but this is like specifically suitable for data management purposes. And if you're interested, you can sign up at osf.io. And you will need an ORCID identifier to register, but ORCID is also free, and our faculty should have it already. And there are some example projects available that you can use as template for your own project. So I highly recommend that you take a look at the Open Science Framework. Okay, then a few words about metadata. So metadata is usually called data about data or information about information. So its purpose is to describe and explain the content and make it easier to retrieve, use, or manage an information resource. So you will use metadata to describe your datasets. And there's descriptive metadata and technical metadata. So descriptive, for example, title, author, subject, genre, publication date, and so on. And technical, for example, file type, file size, creation date, and so on. And also there's like different conventions in different fields. So there can be some domain-specific metadata standards available, like, for example, some vocabularies. So you don't have to come up with all the terms yourself. And of course, you should always try to follow the conventions of your own field. And here's a link to a good metadata guide. There's information on these domain-specific standards. And of course, you can always contact us at the library for more information. About the file formats, as mentioned earlier in the FAIR principles, you should always try to use open formats. So the more open your file format is, the more people can access and also use your data. So ideally, the format should be non-proprietary. It should be in common usage by the community. It should be interoperable among diverse platforms and applications. It should be fully published, available royalty-free, and fully and independently implementable by multiple software providers on multiple platforms. And finally, developed and maintained by an open standards organization with a well-defined inclusive process for evolution of the standard. So this is like the ideal format. Okay, and a few tips for working with active data. Of course, this is not just for research data in particular, but for everything. You should always back up your data regularly and preferably in different locations. So you should follow the 3-2-1 rule for backups. So you should have at least 3 copies of your data, store the copies on 2 different media, and keep one backup in a different location. And also you should always choose the storage media and location according to your needs. So portable media, you should always avoid using portable media because this is like risky and vulnerable. Hopefully nobody is using that as the only location. University network drives are good for collaboration within the university. And cloud services can be used for collaboration with partners from outside the university. And especially if you process and store sensitive data, you should restrict access and use encryption if possible, so that unauthorized users cannot access this sensitive data. And you can always consult your IT department for local policies, tools, and storage locations. And about sensitive data, you have to be specifically careful when dealing with sensitive data. This is, for example, personal data or proprietary data or some other confidential data that should be protected from unauthorized access. So if you share this kind of information, here are some important points to consider. First of all, when you get consent from for the data collection, you should also inform that you're going to share this data. So you will need to get consent for publishing and sharing as well. And you should, of course, protect people's identities. So you will have to modify the data in such a way that individual people cannot be recognized by anonymizing the data. Also, you should control access and use an appropriate license. So you can, for example, restrict commercial use by using a specific license. And I think this is the most important thing to remember. You should always be responsible when sharing your data. And I think the European Commission has a great approach for opening data, because according to their policy, data should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So please keep in mind that all data is not supposed to be opened. It can be as closed as necessary. Okay. Then how to find existing data sets. There's lots of data out there already, but it can be difficult to find sometimes. There are many places to get started and like different types of places where to look. There are directories of repositories. There are general repositories, for example, these OSF, Figshare, Zenodo, Mendeley data. Then there are subject-specific repositories, regional, institutional repositories, and also data journals. And I have lots of links here on the slides. I will not read all of these aloud. I will share these slides with you so you can take a look at them yourself. These are just a few examples. But for example, these directories, re3 data, open door, and fair sharing are the biggest ones. Then here's lots of different subject-specific repositories for many different fields. And then there are also data-specific journals. So these are journals that publish data papers that describe these data sets. So these data papers are articles about the data, for example, how it was collected and how can it be accessed and so on. So the focus is on the data set itself. And these are a few examples from different fields. So for example, BMC research notes, data in brief, scientific data, and so on. And if you use data that is published by somebody else, you should also cite the data, just like you would cite an article. And why should you do any of this? First of all, to ensure scientific transparency, to provide credit for data creators, to aid in tracking the impact, and to help authors verify how their data is being used. So the original authors will be able to see that somebody is using their data set. And how to cite, here's one example. If the data set has a persistent identifier, you can cite it just like an article. Okay, so you should include the authors, publication year, title of data, version ID, publisher, and the identifier, and access date and time. So this is very similar to citing an article. Okay, and you can see that there are many aspects in research data management and many things to consider. And to keep all of this under control, you will need a data management plan. So that's a document where you define what kind of data you are using and how it's going to be shared and protected and published. For example, what data, where is it stored, how is it looked after, where and when is it made public. And these plans are often required by funders or institutions. So you have to comply with their requirements. And there are tools and best practices guides to help you in this process. And we will take a look at those in just a minute. And here's what is typically included in a data management plan. There's a general description of the data set, like what kind of data are you using, how will it be collected or produced, and what's the estimated size of the data. There's also a section for documentation and metadata, what kind of formats, standards, and documentation you are using. Do you have some field-specific vocabulary, for example? What kind of software or tools are needed to access the data, and so on. Ethics and legal compliance, especially if you're handling personal or otherwise sensitive data. You need to describe what kind of legal issues are related to your data management. And access, sharing, and privacy during the project. Which platforms or tools you are using to store and access the data, and how will it be backed up, and who can access the data during the project. And then reusing and redistribution, which part of the data will be published and where after the project, and what kind of license will be used for the data set. And finally, roles, responsibilities, and resources. So who will be responsible for different aspects of data management, and who is paying the cost. And the most common tools for creating data management plans are DMP Tool and DMP Online. So these are both very similar tools. They can help you in many ways. There are these DMP templates and guidelines available. They are based on the funder and institutional requirements. So you don't need to think about section headings, for example, because they're already there in the template. You can also share your plans and work on these plans with others. And you can view published plans that you can use as an example. And finally, here's how to create a brilliant data management plan. So this is from the University of Helsinki library, and it's an excellent wrap-up of everything that's supposed to be included in a data management plan. So an ideal plan has a clear structure and it's easy to understand. Also, it presents the value and usefulness of the dataset. So you explain what is so special and new about this data. It also considers risks and risk management, and it focuses on data management specifically instead of research methods. So this document is different from a research plan, and you shouldn't just repeat what you have in your research plan, but focus on the data. Also, it explains relevant legislation, especially if you're dealing with any sensitive data. And it describes the ownership of data. It has a clear plan for data sharing and future usage. Ideally, this would also include the place where it's going to be published and the license. It describes backups, access control responsibilities, and prepares for the selection of data to be archived, and also destruction of unnecessary data. So this is also very important, because usually you are not supposed to publish all your raw data. Of course, sometimes that can also be the case, but usually it's just the part that is necessary to verify the results, and something that could be useful to other researchers as well. And ideally, you should also get rid of the data that is unnecessary. And finally, the plan also includes the costs of research data management. So of course, if it's a big project, lots of data involved, and if everything is done properly, there will also be some costs for data management. And I have one more slide. So here's some more materials with information on these topics. I highly recommend the Research Data Management Toolkit specifically. There's lots of instructions, videos, infographics, books, other materials on this topic. And also there is a free research data management and sharing course on Coursera if you're interested. So it covers pretty much the same topics that I have covered here. And finally, here are some excellent guides from other organizations. 3 good examples are Oregon State University, University of Pittsburgh, and UCD Dublin. Okay, and you can see that there are many aspects in research data management, and this was just a brief introduction to this topic. And the library will be organizing more workshops on data management and other related topics as well. So please stay tuned and follow the library event calendar. And I'm here to provide data services, so I will be helping you with all of these topics. And if you have any questions or you have some specific project where you need help with data management, you can contact me anytime, and I'm happy to help. So this concludes the presentation, but there is still some time for questions and answers.
May I ask a question, please? First of all, Virio, thank you so much. That was so clear and so useful. It was a really excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. For example, one research project I have, it's quite big. It consists of interviews, and these are obviously confidential, and I wouldn't share them publicly. But you say it's still good to use a data management plan approach because it lets other researchers know what I'm doing so that they can contact me. Maybe some of my data I can release to them confidentially and so on. Is that the case?
Yes, so it's always good to make at least the metadata available. That's like highly recommended. Yeah. Of course, if it's confidential material, then you cannot open it publicly, but you can make at least the metadata available. So that way others can contact you, and maybe you can like privately share some of the data with them.
Okay, excellent. And what would be my first step, like the first easy step for doing that? Would I contact you at the library, or the data manager?
Yes, please contact me first. I have started here quite recently here outside University Library, and I am here specifically for this to provide all kinds of data support services. So please contact me and maybe like describe your case a little bit more, and I'll see what I can do.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you again for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you very much. If there's nothing else, then thank you very much for attending, and please follow the library event calendar for more workshops.